I've always found the intense hatred of Kissinger or the intense admiration of Kissinger to be kind of, weird's the wrong word. It had no purchase on me. Clearly, brilliant man. Clearly, impressive life. I mean, you can't, as we make the point in the Morning Dispatch today, there's no disputing that he was a great man of history in the way we used to think of great men, right? Maybe not as great as the actual leaders, right? Because that's always sort of, one of the great distinctions. But, he's up there. He's on a list with, I don't know, Talleyrand and Metternich and those kinds of people. I don't know how you would rank him above or below. I would say probably below, but I honestly, I don't know. I'm kind of on a 19th century European history kick these days. And so, anyway, we can talk about that too in a second. Anyway, Kissinger. As probably makes sense, as someone who was a, pretty serious anti-communist conservative type. I mean, I should say, first of all, he became national security advisor in 1969, like 2 months before I was born. So he was always in my life a kind of a figure of the past to me, even though, he circled the orbit of a lot of institutions that I've been involved with. He was friends with the Buckleys. He would appear at some National Review type things from time to time. I've seen him speak a few times through AEI. I've seen him on I used to see him on the flight from DC to New York once or twice. I gotta say, he was a Tolkien-esque figure in his 80s and 90s. I mean, sort of rotund, not quite, like he looked like he could have been some kind of dwarf king towards the end. But I'm not throwing stones because he made it to 100, and I'm pretty sure I won't. But so, and I know Hitchens hated him, and Anthony Bourdain, and a lot of the left, and there's a lot of people out there doing these like cheap, war criminal dies. The Spencer Ackerman headline, I'm not going to read his piece. I do not read Ackerman, but he wrote a piece for Rolling Stone, and the headline is just juvenile, petty, and it's the kind of thing that if a right of center place did about a left of center figure, everyone, all the people laughing and giggling and thinking it's great would immediately recognize it for its juvenilia. But the headline is war criminal Henry Kissinger finally dies at age 100 or something like that, And I can even make space for the war criminal thing. I mean, I kind of disagree with it, but like it's the finally dies. Just reveling over people's deaths is always bad journalistic process, but that's me. The thing, so obviously because of the October 7th stuff, I am more, and I've talked about this a few times on here, I'm more attuned to anti-Semitism stuff than I normally am. I usually talk about anti-Semitism as if it's sort of a joke kind of thing. I'm not saying anti-Semitism is a joke, but when I bring it up, it's usually like, they forgot my Diet Coke, and they must be anti-Semites kind of thing. And the thing that sort of always kind of bothered me about that's, again, I'm not ascribing it to anti-Semitism. I can just see why people would wonder a little bit insofar as, there have been important national security advisors, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense in American history. Most of them, when the left doesn't like their policies, they blame the president, right? I mean, they don't blame the functionary below the president. And yet the uniqueness of the vitriol towards Kissinger always seemed like a little bit of a double standard. And now, again, it's like, why wouldn't you just say Nixon's the war criminal rather than Kissinger's the war criminal? And I understand there are a lot of people who call them both war criminals, and that's a defense. And another defense would be that, he was just so much more powerful than a normal national security advisor or secretary of state. In fact, he was the only one to hold both titles at the same time. That you could say he was responsible for policy in a way that you normally would attribute to the president. But it's funny, it's like, as a right-wing anti-communist guy, I always had my criticisms of Kissinger from the right. The sort of, I don't think he was a full-blown realist, but the sort of, Realpolitik, which is a little different than realism, to be honest. I mean, a lot of people use the terms interchangeably, but like the philosophical realism of foreign policy stuff. And I'm just thinking about this out loud. I don't know if I've ever written about this distinction, but like it just occurs to me that the theory of foreign policy realism has always been grounded in a kind of Marxism by proxy kind of argument that nation states have inherent interests and their material interests, essentially. It's almost like reducing nation states to homo economicus kind of thing, and that these interests that are just plucked out of the ether as these inexorable forces of the universe are the things that drive various nation states' foreign policy. And that's the thing I think is garbage. I mean, I really do. I just think it's just factually and historically and analytically untrue. It's kind of like Hobbes's social contract theory, which has the problem that they've never been able to find a society or evidence of society, never mind a nation, where the social contract actually was a thing that worked the way Hobbes suggested. There's no piece of paper anywhere. I mean, the Constitution is not what Hobbes means by social contract. And so it's just rooted, a lot of this kind of stuff is rooted in a weird kind of pseudoscientific anthropology or teleology. And, nation states act on their conceptions of honor. They act on their conceptions of destiny, right? They act on their conceptions of glory, and they also act on the conceptions of various leaders of those nation states and their personal definitions of honor, destiny, and glory, which is why a lot of nation states do things that are not in their interest. You can talk to your blue in the face to me about how Russia's invasion of Ukraine was inevitable because of Russia's historic this or vital interest that. At the end of the day, I'm just going to reject the argument because a saner, wiser, more rational person, and that's part of the thing, right, is like foreign policy realism is supposed to act on rational interest. A saner, wiser leader than Vladimir Putin would not have invaded Ukraine, at least not the way that he did, right? I mean, like, you can make this argument that Ukraine was always going to be a threat to Russia and that Russia was going to do something about it. And that I'm open to if you're grounding that in sort of an analysis of, historical trends and psychological profiles of the Russian elite and all this kind of stuff. But if you're saying there's some cold, inexorable force that was going to force this to happen, I just don't think it's true. And even if it was bound to happen, a different leader might have gotten his army into better shape before invading Ukraine. A different leader might have gotten might have put enough troops on the border before he invaded Ukraine. A better leader might have run his intelligence services so that he didn't believe all of these guys who lied to him about how Kyiv would topple overnight, right? Things like individual leadership abilities and the contingency of what the other side intends to do, these things still matter. And so, like, history just does not unfold in some sort of Hegelian kind of way. And that, anyway, that's the among my many problems with realism. Realpolitik, and maybe I'm just making up a linguistic difference here, but I don't think I am. I probably could do some reading on this. But realpolitik is not bound up in these, systematized, theoretized, abstracted, reified conceptualizations about how the processes of history unfold in a scientific way or anything like that. Realpolitik is just about cold-eyed, no tears. Let's just do what we got to do here. Diplomacy and statecraft, right? You cut deals with bastards if that's what you need to do for your interests. And also, look, I think there's a certain amount of idealism in Kissinger, insofar as he has a certain respect for America's values, America's role in history, American as a safe haven for, the Kissingers. But I think one of his defining thoughts defining goals was, being a refugee from Nazi Germany, was avoiding great power conflict. And avoiding great power conflict requires throwing a lot of little countries under the bus sometimes. And I'm not justifying that. I'm not defending the various decisions he made about Bangladesh or Cambodia or any of these kinds of things. It's been so long since I've read up on a lot of these things that I can't muster the passion to back up what I think are my convictions about some of these things right now, or forget the passion. I just can't muster up the details enough to not walk myself into some sort of cul-de-sac. But I do think I'm right about this sort of great power thing, is that he really, really, really wanted to avoid nuclear war, which is a reasonable thing to want to avoid. And so he cut, Realpolitik, to borrow from the Ching of The Godfather, can be boiled down into sort of it's business. It's not personal, right? These are the things we have to do. This is the life we have chosen. And it can be confused with cynicism. I don't think Kissinger was a cynic. But at the same time, I've always been more idealistic in my foreign policy stuff than the Realpolitik crowd, because I think over time it's sort of like the obsession, sort of like this Trumpian obsession with toughness. There is this thing that when you become obsessed with the virtues and importance of toughness, is you start being tough for toughness' sake rather than towards any actual goal. You start turning toughness from a means to an ends, and I think that can be kind of corrupting. If you're always just looking to take the smartest realpolitik shortcut to your goals, some important things are going to end up being left on the roadside that I think you should be carrying with you. And so that's why, my standard line has always been idealistic about ends, realistic about means. There are all sorts of things that I always think America should be moving towards, certain idealistic things in foreign policy. After, look, again, first and foremost, you have to protect the United States of America. You have to have a strong national defense for the basic reasons of why states exist. But the second order part is where the idealism comes in, which is, and look, my defense of America is idealistic too, because I think it's a great country and I'm patriotic and I want the republic to endure. But like if America became some terrible country, I would care much less about national defense. But in terms of foreign policy stuff, I believe in promoting democracy and liberalism and human rights. I believe in promoting trade. I believe in all sorts of, I believe in standing athwart things like genocide. The thing is you don't have infinite resources, so you have to pick and choose what you can do, what is a reasonable use of your time, because time is really the ultimate resource, and they're just not making more of it. And so you have to be realistic about this. You have to choose. You have to there are trade-offs. We can put a lot of time and energy into this project, but that means we're not going to put a lot of time and energy into that project. And so I think there's a little idealism there's more idealism in Kissinger than I think some of his haters would give him credit for. But like my criticism of his always came down on the right, up from the right. And I remember I had this wonderful friend. I knew him through National Review. We called him Dr. John. He was an Australian. He passed away a few years ago. I'm pretty sure he'd be okay with me telling the story. He was one of these great curmudgeons. And he was this Australian eye surgeon, lived in Southern California. And he was one of these guys, always gruff and curmudgeonly, but then he would tell you stories about all these, Vietnamese kids that he adopted and took care of. He brought back whole families from Vietnam. He was a military doctor, eye surgeon in Vietnam. I think he was still fighting or serving with the Australians back then. And anytime Kissinger came up, he would get angry in a way that has nothing to do with like normal politics stuff. He would get angry because friends of his died because he felt Kissinger abandoned our allies in South Vietnam and abandoned. I mean, I don't want to misrepresent the details of his story, but he could go on at great length about it. And this was always sort of like, my dad's part was like the realpolitik of détente, and trying to get right-footed with the Soviet Union required, from the conservative perspective, throwing some countries under the bus to communism. And that was always the anti-Kissinger tradition I grew up in. And so it was always kind of funny when I became friends with Christopher Hitchens to hear him get blue and red in the face from the left about how much he disliked Kissinger.